This is Gareth Aden, and I'm here this afternoon on behalf of the Nashville Bar Association Historical Committee to take the oral history of Jim Weatherly, one of our past presidents of the Nashville Bar. Good afternoon, Jim.
Good afternoon.
This is a pleasure for me, and I thought we might just begin at the beginning. If you could tell us your name and your date of birth.
Jim Weatherly, James L. Weatherly Jr. is my formal name. Date of birth is August 28, 1950.
Where were you born?
Memphis.
And tell us a little bit about your family and what it was like growing up in Memphis, Tennessee.
Well, Memphis, Tennessee, back in the late 50s and 60s, which is probably the scope of my recollection as I'm getting older, was an interesting time, for sure. There were so many things going on, both socially and politically, that it made for quite an interesting environment in which to grow up. Went to public high school, Kingsbury High School, graduated from there in 1968. My father, Jim Sr., was a salesman, and my mother, Patty, was an office assistant, and have one sister, Suzanne, who currently lives in Georgia.
Were your parents originally from Memphis?
No, my father was actually from Paris, Tennessee. My mother had been born in Arkansas.
As I recall, when you and I have had a chance to just chat, there was a fascinating story you told me about visiting, I think, one of your grandparents. And
Well, actually not a grandparent. I think it was a great aunt and great uncle. My familiarity with them was very limited because they lived in Paris, and we did not visit Paris very often. But we did manage to go for their 50th wedding anniversary in Henry County, I believe it was. And the children gave a significant gift to their parents, and it was an indoor bathroom.
I'm sure to a city boy that was quite interesting.
Gave a whole new meaning to the Sears catalog.
You mentioned school, and I believe there was sort of a guiding force in your not only doing reasonably well in grade school and high school, but also going on to college. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, my mother. My mother was very maternal, as mothers are, but she was very instrumental in pointing me towards a good education, both at the grammar school and high school level, as well as making sure that I was the first in the family to go to college.
Wow. What about in high school there in Memphis? Was it Kingsbury?
Kingsbury.
Kingsbury.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of tell us a little bit about Kingsbury, what you did well in. Did you play any sports, things like that?
I played football in junior high and basketball in junior high, and then my athletic ability never quite caught up with me when I got to high school. So kind of changed from doing athletics in high school to doing plays and speech and things of that nature, theater.
Was that on your own accord, or was your mother sort of prodding you along?
Well, it was basically on the accord of the coaches who told me that I was not good enough to be on the teams. So I was very interested in finding something else that I could entertain myself with. So actually, I had a speech teacher in high school that was very instrumental in me getting involved in theater and speech debate type of endeavors.
And if my own knowledge of students is correct, that probably played some part in a later decision to go to law school.
I think so. I mean, it gave me a much greater sense of confidence, I guess, in being in front of people. And I think if I want to trace back to what might have been an early influence, it had to be, again, my parents and the environment in which I grew up, because I'll never forget one of the neighbors down the street, and my mother told me this, I was too young to remember it, but he said he had never met anyone who could ask as many questions as I could.
Where did your family go to church?
Church of the Holy Communion in Memphis, Episcopal.
And I think your mother worked there, is that correct?
She did. She did. She was an assistant to Dr. Greenwood, who was the rector at the time. And then once he moved to Nashville, they stayed in Memphis for a while, and she was assistant to his successor.
Well, you and I have something in common then, because when he left Memphis to come to Christ Church in Nashville, he was the rector where my family
It's
went
a
to church.
very small world when it
really
comes
is.
to all that,
It truly is.
as we've discussed.
How about your summers during high school? What did that lead you to?
Summers, some work. I think as I got older and was able to find jobs in the summer, worked in a grocery store for a while, and worked at the company where my mother worked, doing summer work for them. But before that, it was pretty much the community center and playing basketball and baseball and tennis and whatever else we could play. We were just eaten up with social activities and athletics.
Those are great years. What about, I take it that since I know you went on to college, were your grades reasonably good in high school?
Reasonably, I was probably in the top 25% of my class.
What year did you graduate?
68.
Tell us about what you decided to do and where.
Well, I decided I was going to be a dentist. As you can probably tell, I don't want to say I'm easily influenced by others, but the dentist that I had grown up with was someone I admired, and I thought, gee, this would be a great thing to be like him. And it probably took advanced chemistry and advanced algebra at the University of Tennessee to convince me that might not be my best calling.
Was this during the Vietnam era?
It was.
Did that play any part in your schooling?
Well, when I turned 18, as any good patriot, I went down to the draft board and signed up on my birthday. And then I think it was December when I came back after my first quarter at UT in Knoxville, got a call from the draft board telling me that I was going to be inducted in January, and I was 1A. And I said, well, are you sure? And she said, yeah, I thought you had were going to college. And I said, yeah, I am. And she says, well, didn't you want a deferment?
On second thought, I guess I did.
I said, how late are you open? So I had a deferment through my first couple of years, and then it was after that they went to the lottery, and my number was sufficiently high that I was not called.
Jim, tell us a little bit about UT Knoxville and how it went as a freshman there.
Adjustment, first time away from home, and I remember that my parents put me on a plane and flew me to Knoxville rather than, I think, like many parents would do, drive their kids there with all their belongings. But there was some kind of conflict and they couldn't take me up. So I drove, and I remember getting off the plane with my big kind of suitcase, chest or whatever it was that was on wheels, and thinking, gee, this is going to be an adjustment.
This is it. I'm on my own.
Yeah. And, of course, during the orientation session, they had us stay in only the best dorms on campus. And then when I got my dorm assignment, I think it was a dorm that was constructed in the 20s or 30s, had no air conditioning, and was kind of miserable to be in for the most part.
Did you join a fraternity?
No, did not.
Well, how did it go, school-wise?
Again, adjustment. I didn't feel like I was very well adjusted to go from high school to college. There's just a lot more demands than we seem to have in high school, and a lot more things to distract you in that first year in college. But after that, kind of the same way with the law school. It's just you have to learn how to do it, and if you've got the determination, you can do it.
Did you know at that time what you wanted to do after your graduation?
No clue.
Okay.
No clue. Other than, again, the idea of being a dentist when I started, and then when, again, the encounter with some of the courses I was taking caused me to rethink and decide that I should probably look at things that I was more interested in than things that I thought were perhaps the best thing to do.
What courses did you tend to like the best?
History.
And did your grades come along?
Yeah, absolutely improved after that first semester.
Well, everybody has to have a little fun
I did.
after high school.
Yeah.
All right, it's always interesting to ask folks if there was any particular professor or teacher in college that had sort of an impact on your education. Was there anybody like that at undergraduate school?
Yeah, I think once I was a political science major at the end, political science and economics as a minor. There was a professor, Otis Stevens, who was blind and was just a great professor and took constitutional law in undergraduate school with him as part of my political science major, and was inspired by him.
Did you talk to him at all about the possibility of law school?
Yeah, sure did.
And I take it he probably encouraged you.
Sure. He said absolutely it would be a great thing to try to do.
During the summer times while you were at UT, undergraduate school, what did you do?
Worked, for the most part. I worked during school. I worked in the food service administration at the presidential complex. I started off as a server on the line and then kind of rose to supervisor. And then by the end of my undergraduate school, I was one of the managers of the complex. So it was, great thing for meeting people and making a little extra money to support yourself.
And it had some real responsibility if you rose to managing.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Didn't take long to figure out I'd rather do that than be slinging the food on the line. Just as a digression, I don't remember Roger's last name, but he was the supervisor on the first shift I ever worked. And when I came in, he said, the tile down there on the floor needs some cleaning. Would you take care of that for us? And I just thought that was part of the job until after the shift was over and the other workers were saying, I can't believe he made you do that. We never have to do things like that. Yeah.
You were new fodder for the cannon.
I was.
What was your graduation date? When did you?
72.
Okay. And during your last year or so as an undergraduate, had you sort of solidified what your plans were for after graduation?
No, not really. I think it was probably towards the end of the fall quarter, and U2 is on a quarter system at that point, that I started thinking more seriously about what I wanted to do, and then made my application there at UT.
So is there anything in particular that made up your mind to go to law school?
Probably my major, the political science and the influence of Dr. Stevens. I had never had a lawyer in my family that had influenced me in any way, and I don't think we'd ever had any social interactions with lawyers as well. But it seemed to be something that would be very interesting and kind of a continuation of the major that I had pursued in undergraduate school.
Was there any problem in getting admitted at UT?
Yeah, I think I was a late applicant, was put on the waiting list, and went over and had a talk with the admissions officer, Dr. E.E. Overton, and tried to convince him that I was very worthy to be moved off the waiting list and into any open spot that came up. So I don't remember now the particulars, but a spot did come open and was admitted.
Well, tell us about your first classes and your first year at law school, what impact it had and what you thought.
Again, a big change. You get that sitting in the row and you get the speech about, look to the person to your right, the person to your left. One of them is not going to be here come Christmas type of thing to really kind of scare you. And you hear the stories about people, cutting law review articles out of books so that, other people can't obtain them. So I think there was a real fierce sense of competition early, but it kind of waned as we went through. one of my most vivid memories was Forrest Lacey, who was our contracts professor. He comes in and he's got his book with him. He doesn't have any notes. He just has the book. He opens it up and says, "Okay, any questions about the lesson for today?" And of course, no one raises their hand to ask any questions. So he then closes his book and says, "All right, we'll read the next chapter and we'll be back tomorrow." And at that point, everybody goes, "Oh, wait a minute, whoa. We weren't used to that kind of method of teaching.
So they did ask questions.
Oh, yeah. There were a lot of questions asked at that point.
I've never heard that one. You know, it's funny you mentioned about look to your right and left because one won't be here. I'll never forget my first exam in law school. And after we had sat there in silence looking over the exam for about 3 minutes, I heard this slam of paper. And one of the students walked right down front and just turned the exam papers back in and left, and we never saw her again.
Right, yeah. Not that unusual.
How did you do your first year?
Poorly for my standards. I was probably in, a little bit over the 2.0 mark. And then again, as I said, it just took a while to understand what was needed in order to be successful, and finished well.
Did you find certain classes to be more interesting than others?
Well, yeah, I was very interested in criminal law for some reason. Criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence. I had a sense after I had been in law school for a while that trial work was something that I wanted to do rather than corporate or just working out of the office. So I tried to focus on those and certainly found those courses more interesting.
Yeah, well, you had a background in presentation,
Yep.
so that makes some sense. Am I correct, Jim, that one of the pivotal aspects of your law school years was that you joined the sort of famous clinic there at the law school?
Right.
What's that about? I think almost every lawyer that's of my generation has heard about the legal clinic at the University of Tennessee Law School, but tell us a little more about it and who was instrumental in the program.
Well, just, fantastic experience, particularly if your interest was in litigation. It was your first walk into a courtroom. Here you are, a third-year law student, and you're being allowed to go into court and represent people. The legal clinic served as a combination of the public defender and legal aid society for Knox County. So indigent people would come to the clinic, seek representation. There were staff attorneys who also served as instructors. And then we had some professors that usually headed up the different divisions of the clinic. Jerry Becker, for example, headed up the civil division while I was there. And Lloyd Kadish was the most recent criminal director while I was there. Gary Anderson actually had been head of the criminal division when I started. And I think they start us out doing uncontested divorces, which if you lose an uncontested divorce, that's pretty difficult. So it certainly built up your confidence, and I quickly moved from that into doing some of the criminal defense representation.
Any particular cases that you recall from your year in the clinic?
Well, a number of them. I'm trying to think if there are cases, because it kind of morphed. When I graduated, I was hired as an instructor to work in the clinic, so at the law school. So that went from 75 to 77. So the stories about cases kind of merge. I'm not sure that anything comes too much to mind, other than, again, my first case at a preliminary hearing where I've gone in, I've got all my notes written out, and it's in front of one of the sessions judges, and it's in a back courtroom, and no one is there but me and my client who's in jail and the assistant district attorney. And every question I tried to ask was met with an objection, that those questions were already asked on direct, Your Honor, and it was sustained. And By the time it was over, the judge found probable cause, which I couldn't believe could possibly happen, although, as we know, it happens
almost
all the
every
time.
case.
Almost every case. And I think I cried all the way back to the car, thinking that my client was staying in jail as the result of my failure.
You know, there's, I think, a story that you have mentioned to me at some time in the past about you're appearing in a Supreme Court case during these years.
It was kind of bizarre. We at the clinic viewed our representation of our clients as being just a normal attorney-client relationship. We were not asking the courts to appoint us. We were going in as counsel. One of the criminal court judges had a different view of that and believed that any representation in his court by a clinic attorney needed to be as the result of appointment. And there was a practice where appointments were certainly handed out to young attorneys who were trying to make a living. And there wasn't much of anything paid for it, but still there was something that could be earned. I had represented my client in the Sessions Court, appeared with her at her arraignment in criminal court, and advised the judge that I was her attorney, and he corrected me that I was not her attorney until he appointed me to be her attorney, and then he appointed someone else. And that just didn't seem to be quite right, and we took an appeal, really kind of an immediate appeal, and was granted by Justice Henry in the Supreme Court, and they called and said, "Come to Nashville, we're going to have a hearing on this." And I drove to Nashville, and it was Justice Henry, myself, and Jack Seaman sitting in a room. And
I remember Jack Seaman.
Yeah, and Justice Henry, and this was when Jack was in the AG's office,
Right.
and Justice Henry looks at Jack and he says, "Have you got anything to say about this?" And he says, "No, sir." So it was great. One called back to the office and told everyone of this great victory, and then I thought, well, this is going to be interesting when I take this order back to the trial judge. That was the reality of the practice.
Right.
Settling in.
Back to reality. Jim, your actual graduation from law school was when?
75.
Okay, but did you continue on the staff there of the program for a couple of years?
As an instructor in the clinic until 77.
Okay. Who else that we would know in the Nashville Bar that was also a part of that program while you were there?
Walter Kurtz.
Oh, yeah.
Walter Kurtz was the senior criminal attorney on the criminal staff. Bob Delaney, who's also here in Nashville,
Sure.
over at Toon Intricate Firm, was there with us. And Bob Tucker, who was here for a while, was in the federal defender's office here. In fact, he was federal defender of the Virgin Islands after a few years had passed. He's now in St. Louis.
Yeah.
Some great people, good lawyers, and just a great environment in which to grow up.
Well, it certainly is a program that has had a lot of impact on a lot of people that you and I practice with. And is that still going on, or have things changed?
Well, I heard Rich McGee's name mentioned earlier before we started this, and Rich was one of the students in the clinic program, and that's how mine and Rich's relationship began. And Rich and I later worked together in the public defender's office.
While you were there in your last years in law school and also as an instructor following that, were you married?
Yes.
Tell us about that.
Well, we married in 72 and then moved to Nashville in 77 and had a child. And then, as happens with those young marriages, I'm sure, we were going in different directions, so we divorced in 78.
Right. Your what did you decide to do after a couple of years as instructor in the program?
Well, the sequence of things is kind of interesting because it turns out that Walter Kurtz had come there to Nashville after being with legal aid here had come to Knoxville after being with legal aid in Nashville, and one of his reasons for coming was to get experience in the criminal practice because he had aspirations of being the first federal defender here in Nashville. And he then returned to Nashville, and Bob Delaney and Bob Tucker had both gotten jobs with the state AG's office. And I thought, well, gee, Nashville sounds like a great place to look into. And I started looking, and actually I think it was Bob Delaney who gave me a reference of people I'd never met or heard of before, but Joe and Barbara Haynes.
And that was your first engagement in Nashville was with Joe and Barbara.
It was in the fall of '77.
Where was that office? They had, several offices. Which one did you practice?
Well, they had two offices. One was in Goodlettsville, and it was very, very nice accommodations in downtown Goodlettsville. But I was on the Buchanan Street, or in the Buchanan Street office, which was somewhat like a curbside practice.
Yeah. And I think you represented a future mayor of Nashville in that practice.
I did.
Who was that?
Bill Boner. It was an interesting situation. He was a state representative at the time, and had been accused of assaulting his former wife's husband or boyfriend, can't remember now which, with a weapon. And there was just nothing to that. And Bill, to his credit, had been known to carry a voice recorder, tape recorder in his pocket, which he primarily used in order to record the names of people that he would meet so that he could have a record of those people, and was great about keeping in touch with folks.
He was legendary on names.
He was, and that was his way of doing it,
Okay.
was using that pocket recorder. But he happened to turn the pocket recorder on when he went to the door when this incident happened, and that was very helpful in his defense.
After practicing for a while with Joe and Barbara Haynes, where did you go? What happened?
Well, what happened was Walter Kurtz was elected Metropolitan Public Defender in the spring in the primary in 1978, and I was not engaged in the type of practice at Joe and Barbara's firm that I really had at the clinic in Knoxville and really wanted. And this just seemed to be an opportunity to kind of get the gang together again. And so I went with Walt. I was actually hired in the summer while Jim Haverin was still the public defender, because so many of the part-time public defenders were leaving. One of the platforms that Walt ran on was making it a full-time job as opposed to part-time. So a lot of the part-timers felt they weren't going to be retained, and I came in the summer to try to help stabilize till Walt could be inaugurated. That was back at a time, which I think pretty much still is in Davidson County, when the election was the primary, and
Right.
the general election
Right.
was rarely, if ever, contested in August.
Right. Who else did you practice with during your years in the public defender's office under Walter?
Bill Purcell, another former mayor.
I wish I'd known you back then. I could have been mayor.
Well, I had one or two people ask me that. I think the question was, when was I running, because of Purcell and,
Well, that's
and
true.
ultimately Carl Dean. But Bill Purcell, Mariah Wooten, who's one of the leaders over at the Federal Defender's Office, Sumter Camp, who's over there, Rich McGee, who I'd mentioned earlier. There were a lot of really good people that Walt was able to bring in.
Any cases that are worthy of recollection now that you were particularly excited about, or
Nothing that just comes to mind. We had so many cases. It was the volume that was really intimidating, more so than the individual cases, because your concern was always, did you have enough time to devote to the individual representations, because you had so many.
Well, on the other hand, you're a young lawyer and you're really getting experience.
Getting experience that you just couldn't get anywhere else.
Exactly.
You go over to the jail docket, as a lawyer, and you've got 30 people who are sitting there in jail, and you're trying to talk to all of them with your investigators who are working with you, and you're going out and just doing your best to represent their interest on very short notice and with very little time to form a relationship. And it certainly was instrumental in forming a familiarity with the practice that most people just never get.
Exactly.
And relationships.
It's day-to-day pressure that you're just immersed in.
Yeah.
And I think it probably helped you later on, because if you got a case with a lot of pressure or time situations that you normally wouldn't like, you were used to it.
Well, there's the stigma that public defenders have always carried, that they're not as good as other lawyers in private practice. And I think one of the running stories that was always funny was the defendant in federal court who came in and was indigent and asked for a court-appointed attorney, and the judge appoints him a lawyer, and he says, "I don't want no court-appointed lawyer, I want to hire me a lawyer." And the judge says, "Well, Mr. Neal, what do you think about that?" Jim Neal was the lawyer that had been appointed to represent him. So that was always a funny story to carry with us. But it's a stigma that exists, and you only overcome it by showing that you can do the job and that you have the dedication to the representation.
Jim, you joined, I think, that office in 1978. How long did you work there?
Till 86.
Okay. And was Walter Kurtz the public defender during that whole time?
He was public defender until 82, when he decided to run for Fifth Circuit judge. And he was elected in 82 to that position, and I ran for public defender in 82 and was elected.
Wonderful.
Served one term.
Was it an opposed election?
Yeah, there were 3 or 4 other lawyers in the election, the most prominent of which was Charlie Galbraith, which made it intimidating as well as interesting.
How about your staff that you put together in 1982 when you were elected?
I was so happy with the staff we had. I was more than willing to retain anyone who wanted to stay on, because one of the platforms, if you want to call it that I ran on was keeping that staff together, staying in place, even though Walt was leaving and going to another position, that I felt I could keep it together and keep us on the same level that I felt we had elevated the job to at that point. But there were certainly people who had other ideas of things they wanted to do, and one of the more prominent hires I had was Carl Dean, who eventually became known as Magic by Judge Wyatt because he was so successful in the practice. And Bill Purcell was there for a while, so it was interesting to have 2 future mayors on the staff at the same time.
Any cases from that stint as the public defender for Davidson County that sort of stand out in your mind that you'd like to talk about, death penalties or anything else?
There's one death penalty case that we had that I'll never forget how that went. Not a good result for our client, for sure, but what seems so arbitrary about the process anyway, and I won't get into a discussion about the yin and yang of death penalty, but whenever you have someone that the state is willing to make an offer of something other than death, then what sense does it ever make to have a death penalty trial? It just seems odd to me, and I found that during the jury selection, the absurdity of it is we have all these people who come in to sit as potential jurors. Some are in favor of the death penalty, some are neutral, some are opposed. Well, it's probably in the interest of my client to have as many of the neutral or opposed people on as possible. And what I found I was having to do was to try to convince people who were opposed to the death penalty that they could give the death penalty so they could sit on the jury. I said, what sense does this possibly make? Here I'm trying to convince people to kill my client. So So that process, I mean, we had a few death penalty cases, but there was only one that where a verdict of death was rendered. And as I shared with you earlier, it was just bizarre. The sentencing hearing, and this was a case where guilt was somewhat at issue, but my client had admitted to multiple homicides, but he claimed that they were self-defense. And so the guilt wasn't totally unexpected, but we were still dealing with the issue of what was going to be the punishment. Was it going to be life, or was it going to be the death penalty? So we're having the sentencing hearing, and just as fate would have it, Walter Kurtz is the judge in this case. And he's presiding over the sentencing hearing. I'm making my closing argument to the jury. It happens to be Good Friday. I'm standing in front of the window giving my best speech and presentation, and there's lightning and thunder going on behind me. And I go and sit down next to the other lawyers in the case, and I'm saying, if we lose this, we should give up our law license. I mean, look, this is Good Friday and lightning and thunder. Who could possibly give the death penalty? But they didn't seem to have much trouble with it.
Yeah. After your 4-year, or as your 4-year term came to a close, did you decide to run again, or what decision did you make?
I decided not to run again, and the reason in part behind it was I just didn't find the position as challenging as it had been before. And probably more importantly, I kind of came to the realization that I didn't go to law school to run an office or to be an office manager, and so many of those responsibilities fell to me, to staff, to hire, to fire if that's necessary, to organize, just things that were outside of the practice of law, which was what I enjoyed more than anything.
And that's something that I think most people forget, and that is that, well, it's a position of public defender, and I'm sure district attorney. A big part of your day is spent in management.
Oh,
it has to be.
Most of it, for sure.
Well, let's see, we're coming to about late 1985, 1986. What did you decide to do?
I was going to go into private practice so that I could get back into a situation where I could do more of what I wanted to do on a day-to-day basis and not feel like I was shirking the responsibilities of the position as public defender, because it was important to have someone there who could take those responsibilities on a day-to-day basis and do the things that, again, I felt like I hadn't gone to law school to do. It certainly was important to be able to recognize good lawyers and to bring good lawyers on that staff. And I felt I had a pretty good sense of that. But beyond that, when it came to scheduling issues and conflicts, et cetera, that exist just in managing personnel, that was not something I really cared to continue. So I just started just sending out some feelers about what else might be available, and ultimately ended up over at Hollins, Wagster, in Yarborough.
Well, that was a stroke of wonderful luck.
It was. It really was. John Hollins had spoken to me sometime during my tenure as public defender, and had said if I was ever interested in getting into private practice to let him know. And I think I shared this with you, my humorous story about my introduction to John Hollins. And, it's a shame that not more people got to know him, because he was quite the character. When I came to Nashville in '77, Barbara Haynes was giving me a tour of the courthouse, and there were two things that I remember prominently from the tour. One was seeing Ed Yarborough, who Barbara described as the most eligible bachelor in the bar. And then, I think he was out in the hallway, but as we walked further down towards the courtroom, I hear this screaming and yelling going on inside the courtroom, and I look through the window, and there's John Hollins in the midst of a jury trial, and Ed's sitting next to him, and he is screaming about something and pounding on the table. And it was just a different mode of practice than I had seen before.
Well, that's, that's a lineup of trial lawyers, and not only criminal, but there's some very good civil trial lawyers in that group
Yeah,
too.
the
because-
diversity in that firm was important to me. I liked that. I didn't particularly want to go someplace where the only thing they did was criminal work, because I was not hesitant really to expand the scope of my practice as competent as I might feel. But John Wagster did exclusively civil work, and excellent lawyer, brilliant guy.
Did John represent State Farm?
Yes, he did.
Yes, I thought so.
He did.
He was a good lawyer.
Excellent lawyer. And then John Norris, I don't know if you know John Norris.
Yes,
but John,
I do.
John was there and was doing a lot of work for Allstate, almost exclusively. John had been one of the lawyers in Walt's first term in the public defender's office.
I didn't know that.
So he had been at UT, and so we'd all had that association. But John had ended up at Hollins and was doing basically insurance defense work. Then Ed Yarborough, of course, was kind of the preeminent criminal defense lawyer with Hollins. Hollins was still doing a lot of criminal defense, but Hollins had also morphed into more of a divorce lawyer.
His career did move towards divorce work as he stayed in private practice.
It did. And as criminal cases would come to him, he would pretty regularly refer them out to others of us in the firm. David Rabin was also there at the time. So
what was David's practice like? Was it largely criminal as it is
exclusively,
now?
yes.
Okay. And he's turned into one of the preeminent criminal defense lawyers in Nashville.
I mean, David has always been an excellent attorney, and he was in the district attorney. He was in the AG's office. When I first came to Nashville, he was in the AG's office arguing their criminal cases before the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court, which is how I got to know him. And then he ended up in the district attorney's office working for Tom Shriver, and then ultimately for Torrey, and then left there, I think, in '85 or around there to, he had been with Dale Quillen for a while, and that was, while he was with Dale Quillen, he wrote his books on criminal practice.
Yes, I had forgotten that. Was Aleta Arthur with your firm for a while?
She wasn't there when I was there, but she had been there previously. And then she and John had moved to South Carolina.
And then I think later on, Jackie Dickson, who is still a partner of yours, came and joined the office.
She did.
Pat McNally.
Yes.
Well, tell us what it was like to practice with those preeminent trial attorneys.
Well, somewhat intimidating, as you might imagine. You could go in and ask for advice, and your immediate impression was, well, why hadn't I thought of that? but that was one of the big draws to the firm, was to be at a place where, I was with people who had lots of experience and people who could give you advice and that you could rely on.
And I'm guessing you heard a lot of war stories from John Hollins.
Well, I think one of the stories David Rabin likes to tell is this was early in my tenure at the firm, and Hollins brought me and Rabin into the conference room to meet with a potential client. And actually, it was the son that was going to be the client, but I think the father was the mayor of some local town. I forget now which one, but it was a misdemeanor case that wasn't, overly serious by any sense. And Hollins quotes a fee in the case, and there's just this gasp. And everybody looks around, and it's not the client or his father, it's me.
That's wonderful.
Really? You get that? I was doing 5 or 6 of these every day over on the jail docket. So that was part of my awakening to the practice.
Well, what a wonderful group to be with. Tell us a little bit before we move on, because I think you joined in 1986, and that firm stayed together until about 2010, largely.
Right.
How did your practice develop?
Well, it started out certainly just doing criminal defense. That's what I was certainly there to do. And then as my relationships with John Hollins and John Wagster grew, I started doing some divorce work and also some State Farm insurance defense. and had developed a bit of a niche in the State Farm area of doing claims against the company by homeowners that were suspected of being fraudulent. So was doing that for quite a while. And then, the divorce practice was just kind of at the feet of John, learning how he did it and relying on him for guidance.
As you approached 2010, had John Wagster already retired?
Yes.
John sort of retired a little early, I think.
John's wife, Linda Lou, has been just afflicted with horrible arthritic condition that has certainly disabled her. And John probably left earlier than he would have otherwise left
Yes.
had it not been for that.
Yes. What finally happened? I know that John went into practice with his son. Was that sort of one of the things that changed the office situation?
John Hollins.
Yes.
Well, when John Wagster retired, we had this series of the senior people in the firm kind of leaving.
Yeah.
John Hollins Sr. was checking out to the extent that he was pretty much at retirement time and was looking to really cut his practice down. Ed Yarborough had been appointed by President Bush to be the U.S. Attorney for the Middle District, so he had left.
Right.
And then John Wagster had retired. So we just kind of all started going our separate ways at that point, and we ended up with Pat and Jackie and I forming our own firm in beginning of 2010.
And how has your practice developed at your current, what at that time was your new office?
It was still a little more diverse when we started than it is today. I mean, today I find 90% of what I do is divorce work, or child custody, family law, as it's more often called. And I think what happens, as we all know, is you develop a reputation in a certain area and you get referrals from other lawyers and from hopefully satisfied clients, and that's kind of what you end up doing.
Absolutely. What about Jackie? What does she do primarily?
Jackie does family law as well. I mean,
Okay.
it's a great relationship that we have, that we both are doing so much of the same thing. She also enjoys probate practice and some personal injury. We still do some personal injury work, but it's certainly not the Morgan & Morgan type of practice.
And how about Pat? Is he also in a lot of domestic practice, or does he do?
Pat actually left the firm.
Okay.
He's gone out on his own, and his practice is exclusively criminal defense, with a really weighted more towards appellate work in the last few years.
Jim, if you don't mind, I'd like to take a few minutes and talk about something that has given you a tremendous profile among your peers, and that is you've done a lot of work for the Nashville Bar and related institutions. How did that start?
If I had to be perfectly objective about it, I would say it started with being elected public defender, because my profile, or people knowing who I am, became much more prominent as the result of that election. And as we used to jokingly say, the appearance of influence is far more important than actually having it, or at least equally as important. So, you became known as kind of an influencer, or a person that was prominent in the legal community, whether it's deserved or not. But I was always interested in the Bar Association, and then was elected to the Bar Board, I think, in '85.
And during that service in your last year, were you the president?
I was.
So that would be in the year of 87?
88.
87, 88, okay. What was that like?
Again, kind of a tumultuous time. We were at the, near the end of the Reagan administration in the 80s, and things were of a serious conservative bent at that point, and it affected Legal Aid, which was another organization I was very interested in. And And there was a partnership that existed between legal aid and the Nashville Bar Association regarding pro bono work. And that kind of became a focus of mine, in part because of my history doing public defender work. And that was something I became interested in.
Yeah, I remember, I think that you and I, as a matter of fact, did a lot of work with legal services in Nashville and in the development.
Yeah, what had happened, the relationship, and I remember conversations I had with Ashley Wiltshire, who was the director at that point of Legal Aid Society, and said, the relationship and the bond that you have with the Nashville Bar Association is your island in this, and you need to stick with this. And if there is a way that we can work closer together and be more supportive of you so that you're not out there on your own, let us know what it could be.
Yeah.
And that kind of led to this partnership with the Bar Association's pro bono practice really being run out of Legal Aid Society.
Well, among the things that I recall from that period was that there were a lot of structural changes that took place in the Nashville Bar and in the leadership
There was.
of the
Yeah.
bar. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, when it came time for the election of the president in the year that I was interested in being president, Johnny Harwell was also on the board, was also interested in the position. And we realized at that point that something that could serve everyone's interest in this might be the creation of a president-elect position. It was difficult to know, any board that you've been on where you have rotating presidents or chair or whatever it may be, difficult to know if you don't have one of those elect positions what the responsibilities are going to be. And Gareth, you've been president, and you had the luxury of serving as president-elect before becoming president, and you know how important that is. And I know when I became president and Johnny became president-elect, I realized it's taken me 3 or 4 months really to hit the ground running and know what all the issues are I need to be dealing with as president. It was also a really transitional time because Alan Ramser had been hired as the executive director the year before when Julia Griffin was president of the bar. And Alan was hired, and he comes in as the first full-time in-house, really, executive director that we'd ever had. So there was a lot going on within the organization itself.
Right. What did we have CLE prior to your term?
No.
How did that happen?
Well, I was one of the charter members of the Supreme Court CLE Commission, and you go back to how did these things happen? Well, I had been president during 1985 of the Tennessee Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. So when the CLE requirement was on the table for adoption by the Supreme Court, it's looking at the leaders of various organizations to put them on the commission. So I ended up being appointed to the commission, which seemed to be a great opportunity for me, for the Criminal Defense Lawyers Group, as well as for the Bar Associations. I think what we realized was CLE was important on a number of levels, certainly important to the bar, educational things. I would go to these to seminars, and I would hear things and go, gosh, how can I be practicing and have not known that? Or that's something new that's happened that's really going to influence my practice, that were it not for the CLE programs, I probably would never have known. For the organizations themselves, it was so instrumental in creating even a stronger bond between the members and the organization, because the organizations were able to provide the CLE programs.
That's precisely been my thought, is that it was what happened during the year that you were president was a large part in creating what I sort of call the modern Nashville Bar Association.
Fortuitous,
no doubt.
for me.
And of course, the pro bono programs and the implications of that for assistance with people who can't afford representation are enormous.
Right.
And they've continued.
Well, it didn't make much sense to me to have two separate organizations providing the same service. And this was one of my projects as president, was to consolidate these services so that it could happen under one roof. And you would have legal aid attorneys who could provide services. You would have pro bono attorneys who could provide services, but they were all coming into the same place. And people would then know where to go. They wouldn't have to be referred from one place to another. There wouldn't have to be a separate office in the Bar Association and a separate office over in legal aid.
Right. Jim, what about your own experience? What is the importance of the Bar Association in Nashville, and sort of how do you rate that as a part of the whole legal scene in Nashville? Is the association doing its work here?
You know, I think that question really could be answered differently by different people. You know, what does it mean to you?
Yeah.
What it has always meant to me is organization and collegiality. You know, I go back to the David Rutherford Award that was put in place that the Bar Foundation gives every year, and David stood for collegiality. That was his issue. When he was president of the bar, that was his main thrust in trying to ensure collegiality. And, you know, I like lawyers.
Yeah.
I always have liked lawyers. Now, I may not like the lawyer who's on the other side of the case from me all the time, but I generally like lawyers. And I think it's just good for us to be together, because collectively we can accomplish so much more than we can individually.
You have also, I think, been an important and leader in the Nashville Bar Foundation. Am I correct on that?
I've been on the board of trustees for the Bar Foundation for several years, and most recently was president of the board.
That's what I thought. What part does that play in what you've been talking about in terms of cohesion of the bar and doing things for the community?
Bar Foundation is probably more oriented towards doing things for the community than it is for the bar itself. What we try to do is to reach out. Basically, it's a charitable beneficial organization that is set up in order to honor people who have distinguished themselves in the practice of law in the bar, but also to act as an organization that can support financially worthy organizations that we believe meet the purpose for which the Bar Foundation exists, and that is to promote the practice of law, both educationally, and knowledge of what the practice of law means in this community. The Bar Foundation has been receiving applications from community groups for years, and we've tried to grow the principle from which our bequeaths can be made, and we're not nearly well enough funded. We haven't figured that part out yet, but we do our best, I think, under the circumstances that we have, to support organizations in the community that benefit the bar.
I had a note that you are also a leader in the Tennessee Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers.
Right back in the 80s, 1985, when I was still Metropolitan Public Defender, I'd been on the board for the Tennessee Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers and was elected to serve as president during 1 year. And I think it was, as I said earlier, that position that led to the Supreme Court appointing me to the CLE Commission.
It's no secret, but you and I share allegiance to the Episcopal Church, and I would really be remiss in not asking you about the leadership roles you serve there. So tell us a little bit about that.
Well, in the parish that I attend, Church of the Good Shepherd in Brentwood, I have served I think, on 4 different vestries during the time that I've been a member of that church.
And probably every time you needed a new priest in the church.
Well, fortunately, that's only happened once.
You're
Our
fortunate.
founding, our planter, as he was called, served for 23 years at the church. And of course, I was on the vestry and happened to be senior warden at the time he announced his retirement. So that was an interesting experience to try to locate someone new. But we were successful in doing that. It took a little longer than we thought, but we think we found the right person.
And this is the Church of the Good Shepherd
Yeah.
in Brentwood.
Mm-hmm.
You've served as chancellor for the Diocese of Tennessee.
You know, I had a lunch with you and David Herbert back in, I think, 2011, where you were familiarizing me with the role of church attorney in the Diocese of Tennessee, and it sounded interesting. And I went to the annual convention and spoke with Joe Brown, magistrate, former U.S. attorney as well. And he had previously served in that position, and Joe said, piece of cake. You know, I was it for, 5 or 6 years, nothing ever happened. So, okay. And immediately, of course, of course, it hits the fan proverbially in a couple of respects. But I served as church attorney for, I think, 7 or 8 years, and then in 19 became chancellor of the diocese upon your retirement.
You bet, and you've done a wonderful job. You've also served the Episcopal Church as a representative, correct? You've been to General Convention.
I have. Just one back in 2018, and was elected to go to the one in 2020. Well, actually, maybe it was 17. It's a triennial convention. I'm trying to keep my dates straight. It was the 20 convention that was canceled. And
Yes.
Excuse me. The 21 convention was canceled, put off until 22. So it was in Austin, Texas in 18 with you and other elected members from the diocese for, it seemed like about 6 weeks. Was it that long?
It's I think 8 days that seem like 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Oh.
So served as a delegate, I think we call it.
Yeah. Jim, I would be remiss not to ask you about your wife and your family, because I know that you remarried.
I did. I'd like to mention first my first son. It's his birthday today.
Oh, congratulations
Which is
to
the
him.
coincidence. He's 45 today.
And where is he living?
He lives in Knoxville, and he's married to Carrie, our daughter-in-law. No grandchildren yet, but they're doing very well. Shelley is my wife. We've been married now for 33 years. I think one of Shelley's most vivid memories was the annual meeting of the Bar Association, where I was introduced as the president, the incoming president. Shelley was going from table to table talking to different friends, and apparently turned a whole tray of condiments over on the Bassberry and Sims table.
Oh,
That's her most
Oh,
vivid
bless her
memory
heart.
of that event.
oh me.
But yeah, we've been married for 33 years. We have 2 children, Ryan, who's 30, and Aaron, who's 28.
And what are they doing?
Ryan is managing a pizza place,
Okay.
Jet's Pizza in Franklin, and Aaron is doing IT work.
Very good. Very good.
Neither wanted to be a lawyer after having parents for lawyers.
Well, I can say exactly the same for my 2. No, thank you.
What did we do wrong?
We've watched Daddy go off to try lawsuits for too long.
Yeah.
What about hobbies, Jim? Before we leave things, anything that you particularly like doing outside of practice?
I've always been an avid golfer. I try to play whenever I have the opportunity. Hobbies back in my younger days, I played on the Bar Association softball and basketball leagues, and just enjoyed athletics.
Yeah, that's fun.
Yeah, it was a lot of
really
fun.
fun.
And
Yeah.
then I was playing in the church league up until I turned 60. when I had hip replacement, and the coach of the church league team let me know it was time to consider something else when he said, you know, Weatherly, slow is one thing, decrepit is something else.
I think they said the same thing to me the day that I was pitching and the ball took one bounce and it bloodied my nose, and I was on the way to the emergency room. The lawyer with taking me said, Gareth, I think probably it's time for you to retire.
It's funny how it takes things like that to get the message to us.
If you don't mind, before we finish, I want to take just a minute to let you talk about your thoughts on law practice, sort of the changes that you and I are seeing in practice over the last 40, 45 years, and what you see in the future.
I'm always reminded of the statement that people make frequently of, it didn't used to be that way. And you have to be younger in order to make that statement, because as you get older, you realize that nothing ever used to be that way, that we live in a constant state of change. You just have to get a little older to appreciate all the changes that occur. How has the practice changed? I mean, remarkably. When you're a go-to-court lawyer, which I always thought I was, you go to the court on Friday for motion docket, and you'd see almost every lawyer in town.
Absolutely.
That did trial work, you know. And now you don't see hardly anybody. Remote hearings that have kind of taken over in many settings, and because of the pandemic, have probably brought about the biggest change. That's an adjustment. I had a trial earlier this year that actually commenced remotely, which was baffling as to how to handle that. With exhibits and the like, it was an exhibit-heavy trial, and getting the organization and getting all that filed, and it just was so different. It wasn't insurmountable, but it was just different. Relationships, I always laugh about judges. When we were younger, you know, we didn't really know the judges, and we were afraid of all of them. And then as we got older, then our contemporaries became judges, and we felt like we knew them all.
We did.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And now as we've gotten much older, we don't know any of them anymore.
Well said, Mr. Weatherly. Well said.
I got to feel that way about lawyers too. It is getting so difficult to put faces with names as we get older, and again, our lack of contact. I was thinking on the way over here today is that we're not having the picnic this year, apparently, because it's always in September, the Bar Association, and another good opportunity, and now these days probably one of the few opportunities for us all to get together and see each other again. And that's a big change.
Yeah, and I sort of agree with you. I think that's one of the key elements to the benefit of being active in the Bar Association, is that it provides you an opportunity to get to know and to see and talk with your fellow lawyers. And I agree with you.
And you know, the leadership of the bar these days, with all due respect to you and me, is just so much smarter than we were at the time. They're so much more involved. And the process that has led to leadership in today's bar is just so different than the process. When I speak for myself, when I was elected president in 1987, I guess it was almost like a popularity contest, as opposed to any sense of who's best positioned to lead the bar for the next year. Almost as if it's an honor that some people feel they're entitled to, as opposed, again, to trying to identify who's going to be best suited to lead. Things are different. I think now the Bar Association is so well organized that people who are rising to leadership positions are so well versed in what the issues are that they hit the ground running and are great leaders.
Well, I think you can be happy that you are a part of all that, and played a part of leadership at a pivotal moment in the Nashville bar when a lot of things were changing. and I think we've come through it well. Jim, it's been a pleasure.
Well, thank you. I just conclude this by saying that life in general is a blessing, but I truly feel blessed to have had the opportunities that I've had and to be called upon and asked to serve in the roles that I have, and appreciate the confidence people have had in me.
Well, thank you for your service, and thank you for spending some time giving us an oral history.
My pleasure.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you now.